This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Freya Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. On today's programme, Death and Nightingales, a tribute to the writer Eugene McCabe, who died last month.
And our Toaster Challenge guest will be poet Joe Woods.
And Peter will be talking about Kathleen Jamie and her selected poems. So, the coffee's made.
The toast is on.
And the books are on the table.
You're the first man he's ever brought in like this. When there's a deal, it begins and ends below in the yard. I watch from the window.
Whiskey. And I'm a journeyman. A stranger.
What is it anyway?
What?
This deal. He wants you to stand in, to buy or sell. Land, stock, anything. To use you.
The heartbreak of this place. Love it and hate it like no place on earth. Tomorrow I leave it forever.
That child is not my daughter. She's not kin to me.
Say what it is that has you moody.
I think you know, sir.
I've never harmed you, Beth.
Yes?
I'm Liam Ward of Braga.
You have a problem, Liam?
3 bombs exploded in London. The man we suspect is a tenant of yours.
Are you honest, girl? Would you deceive me?
He's no one's fool.
He's foolish enough and he's drunk.
Even the best of men can make the worst of blunders.
He made my mother suffer. He should answer for that.
Killing's a small thing. Getting away with it, that's not easy.
A Druid production of The King of the Castle and a BBC adaptation of Death and Nightingales. We wanted to begin this week with an appreciation of the work of writer Eugene McCabe, who died last month.
Yes, indeed, Peter. There were huge outpourings of sadness from the literary community on the 27th of August this year when the outstanding writer Eugene McCabe passed away. He was a screenwriter, a playwright, a short story writer and a novelist, and he's left behind a wide-ranging body of really powerful work that will be read, performed and loved for years to come. Before his death, Colm Tóibín had said of Eugene McCabe that he only produces masterpieces. And since his passing, tributes have poured in, most notably from our president, Michael D. Higgins, who described McCabe as a writer who was able to capture the complexity of differing viewpoints, and particularly of those confronted with bigotry and fundamentalism. And Eugene McCabe was also a member of Aosdána, and Kevin Rafter, the chair of the Arts Council, said Eugene McCabe was unafraid of complexity and nuance. He chronicled both the political and the personal with an eye that was at once searing and humane.
I sometimes think that he was a rather underappreciated writer, and perhaps not everybody is familiar with his work. But can you give us, maybe particularly for those who aren't aware of his writing, some background about Eugene McCabe?
Yeah, I mean, Eugene McCabe, he lived a long life. He died at the age of 90. He was born in Glasgow in 1930, and his family moved to Clones in County Monaghan in the early 40s, and he grew up near the border on the family farm. And where a writer grows up, I think, can have a huge impact on a writer's output. I mean, I'm thinking of Seamus Heaney and Mossbawn, the rural farm he grew up in Derry. And for Eugene McCabe, living close to the border had a profound effect on his writing. He was intensely interested in the border's effects on people's personalities and lives. And I think this found its way very much into his writing. He worked as a farmer until 1966, at which point he began to focus full-time on his writing. But the farm was always important to him as a writer, as it was here that he developed a knowledge and a love for the land. And I think when you read his writing, you see that love of nature is really prominent in his work.
It is, but isn't it also, I mean, you said the border, and I mean, he's very much, I see him as very much a writer of that dark borderland. Can you tell us something about how the border affected his work? Yeah,
I mean, in the early 70s, he wrote what is probably regarded as his most famous set of works. It's a trilogy of television plays on the different traditions in Northern Ireland. It was broadcast on RTÉ in 1973. It was titled Victims, Cancer, Heritage and Siege, and it won a lot of awards. He also wrote The King of the Castle in 1964.
I remember those plays. very well. I mean, I can remember. I mean, they were rebroadcast a few times, I think, by RTE, and they were. I mean, they really got to grips with the troubles of the time. I mean, they were ferocious. I mean, I remember the one about Siege, where the kind of the IRA kidnaps a couple of people, and I remember the one about the UDR man who is killed, and they were very raw. And direct and engaged and compelling and that kind of, getting to
Yeah.
grips with the politics of the day, very immediate.
Yeah, and very brave as well, I think, to write about that at the time. And it received huge attention. I mean, do you remember King of the Castle as well, Peter? That came out in 1964.
I do. I remember King of the Castle. I remember I seem to remember Niall Tobin in a production of it, and then of course we began with a Druid production of it. But I mean, again, it's like a Greek play. I mean, here is this, hugely sort of successful kind of farmer, landowner, all the rest of that. But he's there like a Greek king because he can't get his wife pregnant, and so he brings in a journeyman, to kind of do the job for him. So he's this kind of like he's kind of cast. I mean, the neighbours all kind of despise him and fear him. So it's an extraordinary piece. Scober he's called, but no, it's a very powerful play.
He's great at getting to the heart of the complexities of rural life. And one of my favourite books was Death and Nightingales. I'm sure you've read that too, Peter. It came out actually in 1992. Strangely, around that time, I have to say, it was a really brilliant time for Irish writing. Dermot Healy had brought out A Goat Song just a few years after that. And I always associate the two novels as being one of the finest novels that came out of Ireland at that period. But Death and Nightingales was set in 1883. And really, when you were speaking there about King of the Castle and that kind of power that's going on in rural traditions, I think a lot of that comes into Death and Nightingales too. It's a really superb achievement set in rural Ireland. It's nearly gothic in proportions. It's kind of a horror story. There's ghosts and graves and gruesome revenge. And old hatreds fester in this novel. It's a novel that kind of stays with you. It stayed with me. In fact, I'm going to go back and read it again and just really enjoy it. Alana Hopkin in the Financial Times said when it came out, anyone looking for an explanation of the roots of sectarian hatred will find it there. So again, it's going back to what you were saying there, Peter. It tells the story of kind of hatred really between Catholics and Protestants. And I suppose ultimately the fact that we mustn't abuse love and we mustn't abuse trust.
So it's 1883, and it tells the story of Beth Winters. Can you just fill us in a bit about the story?
Yeah, I mean, Beth Winters, what a great character. It's set against the really tough beauty of the Fermanagh landscape. And we enter the world of Beth Winters. She's a really determined character. It's her 25th birthday. She wants to decide her own destiny, but she's really charmed by the roguish Liam Ward. They fell in love when they pulled a dead bull out of a ditch together. But unfortunately for Beth, she seems doomed to repeat the tragic mistakes of her family's past. And the novel's running theme is the clash between the Catholics and the Protestants. And Beth Winters' love entanglement with the young Catholic Liam turns out to be far from the romance that she hoped for. And Beth's family history is really complex. Her stepfather, he's sometimes quite a violent individual. He's called Billy Winters, is a staunch Protestant. And he married Beth's late mother, Catherine Maguire, a Catholic, when she herself was pregnant by a Catholic man. So it's quite complex. And it's something that Billy, the stepfather, has never got over. Just as Beth's mother, Catherine, never got over the fact that the Anglo-Irish Winters family now own most of the land her family had owned for generations. So when Beth was growing up, she grew up as kind of a pawn between these two parents of hers. And so when the stepfather turns on Beth, she hatches a plan. So I don't want to give away too much, but it's a very dramatic story, which you do not forget. Liam, Beth's boyfriend, hates Beth's stepfather, Billy, for his power and wealth. And Liam asks Beth to act out against her stepfather in a way I don't want to reveal, but let's just say gradually Beth realises that Liam is not exactly who she thinks he is. And there's a twist in the novel, which shows really, I think, decades of pain and betrayal, which build to a really devastating, deadly climax. And Beth, I think, as a woman, is forced to become as ruthless as the men around her.
And we heard Jamie Dornan in the BBC adaptation of that, playing the part of Liam in the novel. But I wonder, because It's always great to hear an example. Would you mind reading perhaps a little of that book?
Yeah, no problem at all. And actually, you were mentioning Jamie Dornan there. He's known for his part in The Fall, but he did play a particularly macabre version of Liam in the film. I suppose you could nearly see it as a historical work of crime fiction. It's a real page turner. But yeah, I would like to read just the opening section. You see, I think about Eugene McCabe, he's a master craftsman. And the bit I'm going to read you, you'll hear that in the language. It's the opening page. It's Beth Winter's 25th birthday. She's waking in 19th century County Fermanagh, and she's dreaming of poisoning her stepfather, Billy Winters. And there is also in the piece I'm going to read a reference to the Nightingale of the title. A lack of bird call, a sense of encroaching light, and then far away the awful dawn bawling of a beast in great pain. For a while it stopped, as though birds and ditch creatures were listening, respectful of approaching death. Then she heard the beating of her heart and saw herself in Billy's study reading about medieval medicine from the chemist and druggist 1880. A cure for insomnia. The milk of a human female placed on the forehead will induce sleep. Place the heart of a nightingale under the patient's pillow. Poisons, aconite, arsenic, ergot, oil of bitter almonds. The Reverend J.H. Timmins, vicar of Westmalling, was acquitted on the 18th of July of a charge of manslaughter. Defendant believed the teaspoon of oil of bitter almonds administered to his wife was oil of sweet almonds. In the dark pantry off the scullery, she was looking into the hanging press full of veterinary medicines and gadgetry, and yes, there it was, a small pale yellow bottle labelled oil of bitter almonds with a separate label which said poison. She put it to her nose and sniffed. The astringency of death invaded her lungs. As she watched herself pouring out a teaspoon for Billy's protruding tongue, her whole body began to shake. The teaspoon trembled, spilling, and she woke to the bawling of a beast reverberating round the stillness of her bedroom. Then a dark silence.
And that was Enda reading from Eugene McCabe's Death and Nightingales. I suppose, and I mean, the only criticism you could make of Eugene McCabe was that he perhaps didn't write enough. I know he said himself that I write very, very slowly and I throw a lot of stuff out. Maybe we might wish that he didn't throw so much stuff out. I mean, he's such a powerful and complex and interesting writer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually feel he was prolific, actually. I mean, as I said earlier, he has actually produced so much that will last. And we didn't mention his short fiction either. It included the novella and stories Victims, A Tale from Fermanagh. I remember reading and really enjoying Heritage and Other Stories, which came out in 1978. Christ in the Fields, a Fermanagh trilogy. Tales from the Poorhouse, Gallery Press published that. And Heaven Lies About Us, that came out in 2005 from Cape. So I actually think he actually achieved an awful lot. So I'm going to disagree with you there, Peter.
Okay, well, I hope we've given readers and listeners enough material to pursue an interest in a fantastic writer, Eugene McCabe. Thanks, Enda. This morning's Toaster Challenge guest is poet Joe Woods. Joe is the award-winning author of 3 poetry collections, Sailing to Hokkaido, 2001, which won the Patrick Kavanagh Poetry Award, and together with his second, Bearings, was reissued by Daedalus Press in a single volume entitled Cargo in 2010. Ocean Letters was published in 2011, followed by Monsoon Diary in 2018. And just a couple of things that have been said about him. Elaine Niquillon, for example, his voice is easy, melodic, seeming sometimes casual, sometimes deceptively smooth, but always alert. Another one, the strength of the poems lies so much in their alert poise to the subtlest nuances of melancholy, nostalgia, present absorption and timeless epiphany. And that was from Matthew Clegg. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting, I think, for our purposes this morning, is the alertness that Elaine praised is often rooted in the observational keenness that comes from movement and travel, whether that's driving to Delvin or sailing to Hokkaido or browsing in a bookshop in Rangoon or trying to come to terms with a new life in a new country, a new language and culture. So, widely travelled, Joe lived in Japan in the early 90s and has travelled extensively and often in Asia. He's edited various publications, including with Irene de Angelis, Our Shared Japan, an anthology exploring the influence of Japanese poetry and culture in general on Irish writing. He moved to Myanmar in the years leading up to the democratic elections there. He now lives in Harare, Zimbabwe, with his family. So maybe that's possibly a good point to begin with, Joe. Just this whole notion of travel and the way that's affected, I suppose, both life and work. But to begin with Japan, I mean, because Japan was the first, I suppose, place outside of Ireland that you lived in extensively, and it clearly left a big mark on you.
Yeah, very much so, Peter, because I suppose it was my first, a big kind of first sojourn abroad, or first time. I mean, it was a couple of years, I think from 91 to 93. And, I suppose for me, it was when I went there, I kind of was very much a kind of an apprentice poet. And, I was searching around for, scribbling here and there, but never quite, never quite finding a kind of a theme or a form. And I suppose when I arrived in Japan, kind of, it's a long story, but kind of almost accidentally. And I had absolutely no preparation in the language. I think I knew one word, which is ringo, which is the Japanese for apple. And I just, kind of found myself, in some ways, I was working there, I was teaching there, but also found myself adrift to some extent, adrift in a difficult and complex language. And
did you manage to get a handle on that?
Well, the funny thing is, I studied it. I studied Japanese, probably studied Japanese more seriously than I studied any language. But I think my Japanese teacher said, as you know, Japanese people are very polite. But like after about 2 years with this teacher, she said, you really are the worst student I've ever had. So, but I think it made me, in a weird way, kind of examine English in a weird way, and kind of made me. Also, was probably because I was teaching English, but it made me kind of go inward in a certain way. You're kind of at home in your own little language bubble, I suppose. And then it's interesting you should say that, because I kind of forgotten, but my the first poem that I had published was in Japan. So it was, for me, it was kind of a rite of passage, and the whole thing of being abroad and looking back and examining things.
Well, Joe, I had the wonderful pleasure of reviewing your recent book of poems, Monsoon Diaries, for the Dublin Review of Books. And that's gleaned from your travels over the last few years, this time living with your wife and young daughter Eliza in Myanmar. I particularly loved the first poem. It's just 21 lines of 7 compact verses. We're immediately presented with the start of Yangon's relentless monsoon season of the title. And if I can just quote the poem, it says, "It starts as a single applause on the zinc roof, rising to the fury of white noise." I really like those lines. And I'm just wondering, just how did the relentless rain of this season and living in Myanmar inspire you?
Well, it's funny. You should pick on that end, because the monsoon, it's kind of regarded by the Burmese as it's a kind of a romantic time, in a sense. And I know various poets will kind of allude to the monsoon as being a time of, it's kind of romantic, and it's kind of slightly surreal and gothic. But when we arrived with our 2-year-old, we actually arrived in the middle of the monsoon, and I found it incredibly oppressive. And I had this impression that we were going to a hot country, because we'd been to Burma before at the right time of year. So it's very strange. It's a funny season, but it is kind of strangely inspiring. It's kind of oozing atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. In a way, I'm kind of jealous. I'd say you got so many brilliant poems out of it, Joe. But also in the book, other far-flung and native destinations are prominent in it. The South Pacific, China, Chicago, Asia, and even in Louth, Westmeath and Meath and Kerry are just some of the places described. But to me as a reader, I really felt that the strength of the book was not just in the physical journeying. I'm thinking of Henry Miller saying one's destination is never a place but a new way of seeing things. So in your book I felt it was the emotional thing of the death of your father, for instance, the birth of your child, poems like Biography with this waltz. They're all particularly heartbreaking. So it was an emotional time for you as well, wasn't it, Joe?
I suppose because there was quite a gap between the last book and Monsoon Diaries. And, I suppose the birth of Eliza was, I kind of often think it was like that Rilke notion of, you must change your life. And we'd had a kind of a relatively stable life for about, 12 years before that. And then suddenly, in a strange way, I suppose we just decided we had this sudden window, an opportunity to go to Myanmar, and we just thought we'll take it. But I suppose what you're referring to as well is with when my daughter was born, my father passed away at exactly the same time. And it kind of, it did kind of, you knew some serious change was going to come about. And I suppose it was, you're right in seeing that kind of, there was this kind of emotional kind of...
I mean, those lines, and so in early
reaction.
April she arrived, all safe and perfect, and you let go of the reins, duty done, a last responsibility seen through. Wonderful lines there, remembering your father, just when Eliza was born. An emotional time.
Yeah, and it came to a point, I mean, during those years, that I wrote so many kind of what I would call dead father poems that I almost had to kind of create a poem with the voice of my father saying, enough of your dead father poems, because it became a kind of it became a kind of a trough at one stage that I couldn't quite get out of, and I think that was it was all part of the book and its trajectory.
It's a wonderful book.
And then you and your family moved to Zimbabwe, Joe, and what was that experience like?
Well, it's been very interesting. I think sometimes Burma or Myanmar is often mentioned in the same breath as Zimbabwe, as kind of to some extent basket cases. So we have a predilection for these places. But I suppose also I never, although well travelled, I remember thinking, I leave Africa for the next life, that I didn't really see Africa as part of the, on the horizon. And it's been a complete revelation. I really, really love it. And I love the country, like the people. And then suddenly kind of woken up to being there for 5 years at this stage,
And it's a difficult period, isn't it? I mean, it's not an easy place to live.
It's very, I mean, we've been there kind of through the, I sometimes think it's funny because we kind of experienced the stasis of a dictatorship in the form of Mugabe. We experienced that stasis, then we experienced the coup and the presumed reform, and now it's kind of back to it's the kind of Nietzsche's endless cycle, but at the same time life goes on, and it's a beautiful country. It's and ultimately it's where we've made our life for these past 5 years, and that really grows on you.
And Joe, clearly it's affected your writing too. And in fact, you've brought in a new poem about Harare that you're going to read for us.
Yeah, I'll just read this poem. I suppose it's inspired. I think the next book will very much be, I think, set in Zimbabwe and that kind of usual toing and froing between Ireland. But I think it's very much I've been very much rooted in the place. And I'll read this poem, and it starts off with a line from one of my favourite poems by Austin Clarke, which goes, "For the house of the planter is known by the trees. Sweet suburbs of Harare, and their bungalows that are known by the trees, parades of purple jacarandas, ponciettas and flame trees, and beyond their boundaries, swords of green edging to the road, with sprinklers levitating even in dry season. and the sweeping, swish sweeping by liveried gardeners always in blue, who bid boss or sir to my passing good morning, or who pause and chat among themselves in front of compounds whose walls are topped with sometimes sizzling electric wires and unforgiving electric gates that snap shut after a glimpse of the interior. Every avenue looks the same, and were it not for the colour of ornamental trees, you could get lost among the reassuringly foreign street names: Sandringham, Churchill and Windsor.
Oh, Joe, thanks for that beautiful new poem. The house of the planter is known by its trees. Our dog is lying in his basket here snoring. I don't know if that's a good or a bad sign, Joe, but perhaps he loved it as much as we did. And thanks also for talking about your new book of poems, Monsoon Diaries, published by Daedalus Press. Well, I think we're totally warmed up now, Joe, for the toaster challenge. Are you ready for it? Peter's getting the bread ready.
I hope so.
The coffee is definitely on and we're ready to put the bread down. So you've brought in a book. I won't reveal what it is, but I'm really excited to talk to you about this because it's a favourite of mine too. So we're getting ready. We have the toast. We're putting it in. 1, 2, 3 and off you go.
So today I'm bringing to the breakfast table the book A New Path to the Waterfall by Raymond Carver. And I suppose what you bring to the breakfast table all depends on, what time of the year it is or whatever, the way you have so many different kind of choices and things. But recently, a friend of mine asked me for a poem for her father's memorial service. And I remember actually when I was in Poetry Ireland, we were always getting calls for poems for births, marriages and deaths. I used to call it the Office of Births, Marriages and Deaths. And this is actually a very popular poem that we used to offer. And I suppose recently it made me think about that book and just how important it was to me, and such a marvelous book. But I'll just read that poem. It's very short and it's very pertinent, I think, to the book. Late fragment. And did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. And it's a wonderfully popular poem, but the book is very interesting. I encountered it, I think, the year it came out. I think I picked it up in Dublin, and it's posthumous. Carver died in 1988, and at the then what I thought the very old age of 50, he died of lung cancer. And no, he's primarily he's a wonderful short story writer, and he was renowned for that within his life. But he had this kind of strange fidelity to poetry, and he was a really, really wonderful poet. And it's interesting that when he was in his last year, he decided that he would devote his time, the time that was granted to him, in preparing this book of poems. And he did it with his last wife and muse, Tess Gallagher, whom he lived with for I think the last 10 or 11 years of his life. And he referred to those years as gravy. They were the kind of the gravy years. And it's just a marvelous book. It's the poems are conversational. They're just quirky. They're just they're just fantastic. And for me, I think I was probably in my early 20s when I encountered it. He did what William Carlos Williams does. He made it appear easy. He made it, for an apprentice poet, he kind of made it look like you could do this, because he had this wonderful free forms. And
yeah, you're absolutely right, Joanne. Sorry to interrupt you there. I'm nodding away here because you're on a roll. We unfortunately have to bring an end to that toaster challenge. And Peter, I was waving the clock there, but that was such an enthusiastic response to a book which I'm sure is a favourite of many other people. I'm thinking of Edna Longley, and she said in the London Review of Books that a Carver poem instantly establishes its presence. And I remember that thrill of reading the introduction as well by Tess Gallagher when she described their final days together, how they rushed off to Reno to get married. died, and many of the poems as well were, is this correct, Joe? He had taken passages from Chekhov and he'd cut them up into poems. And then, of course, when he died at the age of 50, as you said, the New York Times wrote, "American Chekhov dies."
And also he had Millwash poems in interleaving the book, which is very interesting. And that I think that was my introduction to Czeslaw Miłosz's poetry as well. You know, there was a wonderful kind of generosity about
there
the
was.
book.
And as you said, an honesty, and he made it look all so simple. Well, I think actually we've reached the end there of the Toaster Challenge. We're both hugely pleased that Joseph Woods was here with us today, and all details of Joe's book and Raymond Carver's book, A New Path to the Waterfall, will be available on our website, www.booksforbreakfast.com. So, Peter, what have you been reading this week?
I've been reading Kathleen Jamie's Selected Poems, which is published by Picador, and, well, it came out a couple of years ago, but it's a generous selection of her work to date.
And Peter, can you tell me a little bit about her?
Sure. I suppose, well, some basic biographical facts. She was born in Renfrewshire in Scotland, studied philosophy in Edinburgh. She was awarded an Eric Gregory Award when she was 19, and she used the money to travel to the Himalayas, for instance, and she used those experiences to write travel books, a book about Pakistan, and a book that was published as Among Muslims Meeting at the Frontiers of Pakistan. And actually, this is something that comes back into her work. You know, so prose indeed remains important because she's well known now as well as a poet, as an essayist, a writer about nature in books such as Findings and Sightlines and Surfacing.
Yeah,
but
I remember reading those, but it's really, I think, her poetry that you keep going back to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, she's very well known now. I suppose she's established as one of the leading Scottish poets of the day, and she's sometimes described as, you know, a feminist poet or a nature poet or a travel writer or as a Scottish poet, but she kind of resists that categorization. I think that's one of the things that makes her interesting. That, you know, she doesn't fit easily into any of these categories. What I actually value is maybe her particular way of seeing and speaking, her particular tone, her, if you like, angle of attack, her phrasing, her verbal energy, all the things that are really hard to describe, but that make us want to go back to a poet. But at the same time, I mean, she has said herself, you know, I have what Robert Louis Stevenson called a strong Scots accent of the mind. And my constellation of interests seemed to include the natural world, archaeology, medical humanities, and art. And to produce work, I've walked and sailed many miles and benefited from the company and expertise of visual artists, pathologists, curators, ornithologists, and so on, birds and whales. She also mentioned.
But just to keep it chronological, the early poems, let's have a little chat about that, because she published when she was very young, and there's a great story about how she got published, isn't there?
She left the manuscript of her first book on the doorstep of her publisher, and then 2 weeks later she had a letter from him saying, "Oh yes, I like these. Let's publish them." And those poems are included in this selection. You know, from the first collection, kind of Black Spiders, the title poem, Women in Jerusalem. And, you know, all the, like, the early poems they're very strong. They're very kind of bravura. They're kind of cool as well. You know, poems like Mr. and Mrs. Scotland Are Dead would be a well-known. So it's slightly cool, slightly distanced in a way. I suppose for me, it starts to get really interesting as she develops. I mean, I love the collection Jizn, for instance, and it starts, you know, like a poem like Crossing the Loch from that book. Remember how we rode towards the cottage on the sickle-shaped bay that one night after the pub loosed us through its swinging doors, and we pushed across the shingle till water lipped the sides as though the loch-mouthed boat. You know, lipped the sides, not lapped. I think that's
I like that. It's kind of mysterious, isn't it?
It's mysterious, and it's kind of precise and urgent, and it kind of pitches the drama of the moment against the unlived future, if you like.
There are poems, I think she's great at writing poems of huge simplicity and directness too. Would you agree?
They're very musical as well. I mean, I suppose an example of that kind of poem would be Lochan, almost like a Derek Mahan-esque opening. When all this is over, I mean to travel north by the high drove roads and cart tracks, probably in June with the gentle dog roses flourishing beside me.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
that
beautiful.
kind of thing.
Or what about a poem like Saint Bride's? Would you read a piece of that for us, Peter?
So this is women's work, folding and unfolding, be it linen or a selkie skin tucked behind a rock. Consider the hair in jizzen, her leveret's ears flat as the mizzen of a ship entering a bottle.
That word jizzen, I mean, is it an old Scots word?
It's an old Scots word, I think, yeah, for childbed. It's a reminder of maybe that, you know, the poet's true linguistic allegiance, and maybe a signal of the kind of energy that comes into the work as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's great poems there. You know, Meadowsweet is a fine, angry poem based on the tradition that certain Gaelic women poets were buried face down. But we also get to the poems, if you like, about nature. But what's interesting about them is the way she kind of comes at it. I mean, there's a lovely poem, Alder, for instance, which begins, "Are you weary, alder tree, in this the age of rain? From your branches drew clots of lichen like fairy lungs. Won't you teach me a way to live in this damp, ambiguous earth?" So it's kind of like that surprising address, but also very precise language, and all, you know, if you like the kind of stately procession of it. And you know, there are poems that are often startlingly clear. There's a lovely one which is called The Dipper. Mm-hmm. It was winter. It's very short. I'll maybe just read that. It was winter, near freezing. I'd walked through a forest of firs when I saw issue out of the waterfall a solitary bird. It lit on a damp rock and, as water swept stupidly on, wrung from its own throat supple, undammable song. It isn't mine to give. I can't coax this bird to my hand that knows the depth of the river, yet sings of it on land. You know, so it's just that kind of musicality.
A poem of hers I really love is Pipistrelles, about the bats.
Oh yeah,
That's
I know that.
in that book. What a wonderful poem.
That's in that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's got the trees standing around watching them. Oh, it's so beautiful. And the word Pipistrelles as well. You're speaking of musicality in her work.
Yeah.
The title of that poem has just got such wonderful music to it. But Peter, she's not a poet who writes a lot, is she?
No, she's quite parsimonious about it. I mean, she's often gone, she said, for years without writing a poem. And, you know, she said that she can spend up to 6 weeks maybe writing a single poem. Well, we all know that feeling. But you can see that in the craft of it. On the other hand, you know, you get a set of poems like The Bonniest Company, which was published in 2015. And she gave herself the challenge of writing a poem every week. And in that, there's a poem that, for me, sums up her thinking about poetry. She loses her copy of Machado's Soledades, and she finds it under a beech hedge in her garden, and it's open at a particular page, as though the breeze riffling through had spotted his own name among the master's lines, and they are, "The deepest words of the wise man teach us the same as the whistle of the wind."
Yeah, the deepest words of the wise man teaches us the same as the whistle of the wind. Yeah, they're beautiful lines. Well, one of my favourite poems, I mentioned Pipistrelles, but another very characteristic kind of Kathleen Jamie's is The Overhaul from the book of the same name. So you're really wonderfully telling us about her work, Peter, but I was just wondering, could you tell the listeners a bit about it as well, The Overhaul?
Yeah, again, it's one of my favourite poems too. It's very much a poem about waiting and about patience. I suppose the kind of patience that you need to write as well as to live. So she sees a boat out of the water for repair, the overhaul. Look, it's the Lively, hauled out above the tide line up on a trailer with 2 flat tyres. What, 14 foot? Clinker built and chained by the stern to a pile of granite blocks, but with the bow still pointed westward down the long Voe, down towards the ocean where the business is. Inland from the shore a road runs, for the croft scattered on the hill where washing flaps and the school bus calls, and once a week or so the mobile library. But see how this duck-egg green keel's all salt-weathered, how the stem, taller like a film star than you'd imagine, is raked to hold steady. And it finishes, "Hey, Lively, it's a time of life thing. It's a waiting game. Patience, patience."
Mm-hmm. It's always interesting where her poems take us, isn't it? I mean, always the unexpected and driven by a very strong sense of where she is at that time. She situates us really well, doesn't she? So, Peter, in poetry classes that I teach, I've often used her 7 lessons for writers. I know you have as well. They're kind of interesting, aren't they? And I was just wondering, for anyone out there who wants to write or is interested in writing poetry, can you tell us a little bit about the ideas that she puts forward? And, the kind of, it is sometimes quirky, I think, the advice she gives us about writing poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just mention these very briefly. I mean, the first one is allow connections to occur, and it's because poetry is all about making connections. She says one might well look up from sorting the socks and hear the cry of an oyster catcher. Why should those things be separate? Is the idea?
Yeah.
So that's one, connections. The other thing is be exposed. It says like the sense of being open, like a cormorant drying its wings, she says. And she says, you have to pay very close attention to detail and don't refuse whatever strikes you as banal. It's just, again, it's about attention.
Attention. She also has something about notebooks. I mean, writers go on and on about their notebooks, but actually Kathleen Jamie, I like her kind of feisty approach. She says, don't use a notebook. Isn't that right?
I have to say, I've never used a notebook in my life. I can't. I'm incapable of using notebooks. Maybe she feels it's kind of just distracting. But her main thing is it's like the poem I just read was about patience, and she, one of her tips or hints or notions is have patience, and she, and again in that she talked about having to spend 7 years writing a slim collection, that kind of thing, and kind of related to all these is refuse pigeonholes. Like she doesn't like being classified or categorized, and she just says she's been called this, a woman writer, Scottish writer, and so on.
And then a nature writer.
Nature writer. And she's, so she just kind of, but she also says, as for writing about the natural world, it's as natural, she says, as having a body yourself. And anyone who doesn't engage with nature is deluded.
Yeah.
So that's.
I think, it's good advice. She also said, look closely and listen hard, which is something I really agree with. And doesn't she say something like it's that quality of attention that I aspire to, that I want to emulate?
She does. Yeah. I mean, I always like this poem. She was at a boring meeting in university, and people were there with their spreadsheets and their fake kind of jargon-filled talk and all the rest of that. And she runs out and she lies down in a field of bluebells, and she kind of says, that was in a poem called An Avowal, but she says she wants to keep in with the bluebells, not the spreadsheets.
Yeah, it's really nice. I mean, that idea, I think it's her 7th point, she says, pay attention to the moment, but don't forget about deep time.
Yeah, because that thing about deep time is important. Like it's all those archaeological layers and that fascinate her. Signs of previous civilizations, dug up bones, caves, all that sort of stuff, mythology. It's immediate time, but deep time as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, thanks for that. That was Peter talking about Kathleen Jamie's selected poems published by Picador, and all details are available on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again next Thursday morning. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.